Hello, and thank you for coming to our lunchtime panel. This is a new feature that we're introducing at this summit because we have such esteemed speakers at our summit that we'd like to get a little bit more about their background and their experiences. And throughout the summit, we've heard encouraging words about the future of the water and the agricultural and the aquaculture industry. And this is a chance to hear about how they shaped their careers, if they shaped them or if they were more haphazard, and what lessons we can gain from them. So I'd like to briefly introduce our two keynote speakers and one of our panelists that are joining today. We have Rajiv Singh from Rabobank North America. Unlike the previous panels, I put up some of their previous positions as well, so you can see the breadth of experience we have. We have Dr. Christopher Briggs from the Water Footprint Network, and we have Liese Dallbauman she's the founder of Integrated Water Stewardship with a long career in the industry as well. So to start us off, I'd like to just briefly hear from them how their career shaped from their school choices or from their graduate program until their current position.
Okay, well, I'm going to say, first of all, I have never had a plan. So I don't know if I suspect some of you are going, oh, thank God I don't need a plan. And some of you are going, what's wrong with this woman? How does she get anything done? But it's literally true. And I can go all the way back to when I was an undergrad. I wanted to take a graduate class because I thought it sounded interesting. It was a graduate transport class. And I went to the professor and said, I would like to take this class. I don't know, if I can handle it. And I had had him before for the undergrad version. And he said, well, are you going to graduate school? I said, no, absolutely not. And sure enough, what did I do? So when I was flying around to find somewhere to go to graduate school, I was visiting campuses, and I sat next to a woman on the plane who was basically going and visiting possible postdoc positions. I had never heard of a postdoc before. And this sounded like insanity. She was a chemist, and chemists do like multiple postdocs over years. And I said, well, I am never doing that. Yeah, I did. So just from that point on, I just kind of wander all over. The unifying thread for me has been environmental separations. And even that wasn't necessarily a conscious choice. It was clear once I was far enough down the path that, oh yeah, okay, I am doing environmental separations. And I do it in different ways. I've been at NASA trying to keep astronauts healthy and safe and breathing and drinking water and so on. I have been at the Gas Technology Institute looking at cleaning up water after oil and gas drilling and looking at how to do carbon storage underground. And at PepsiCo, I was looking at how do we make sure that we are being good water citizens in terms of what we use and what our supply chain uses. And that started out in the plant, how do we clean up water? How do we treat water? So there is a unifying thread, but really no strategic plan whatsoever. Possibly my two fellow panelists have been a little more organized than I have been.
I was always interested in natural history, so that's what I wanted to do. My father was a doctor, would have liked me to do medicine. I thought about veterinary, but basically I was interested in zoology, biology, botany, so that's what I did, and I went into university in zoology. And I knew I wanted to try doing research, and so I went straight into a PhD. It wasn't really purposeful that I worked in marine biology. I was actually looking for working on large terrestrial animals in Africa. But they don't take people to do those sorts of PhDs unless they have previous experience. So I wasn't within that labor, nor was I able to do terrestrial mammals even in the UK, because, again, you have to know the right people. And if you don't have connections within your university, it doesn't work. So I did marine biology as a PhD and enjoyed my time. Did not consider that I ever wanted to teach or do any further research, and found myself a little bit less enthusiastic about science by the end of my PhD. And I think that came out because the first conference that I ever went to, I met somebody who was working on an identical species of starfish on the other side, over here, on identical sublittoral tidal ecology. And he would not speak to me about his work at all. He was not prepared to discuss anything because he was worried that I would steal his ideas or things. And I realized that this probably wasn't the line of work that I was most interested in. And so after PhD, I went straight into working in natural history organizations in the UK, and knew perfectly well that I still wanted to work overseas, spent a spring in India, a spring in Eastern Africa, and determined that I needed to find a way to get overseas. And so I actually purposely looked at organizations that could do that. And because I hadn't got prior experience or lived in developing countries, it was quite difficult to get a job in the NGOs, quite reasonably. WWF or TNC or any of these organizations wouldn't take you because you didn't have any experience. So I entered a competition to be in a sort of quasi-governmental organization called the British Council that works around the world and does science linkages, it does projects. They also do lots of things on English and culture. So I went into one stream of that and was sent around the world, first of all in Yugoslavia, then Mexico, then Tanzania. And by that time I had enough experience that when I left them, I could go straight into a job running a project in northeast Brazil, working for a commercial company. And I realized that I'd broken through in the sense that I had now experience, I had a doctorate, I had languages, and I was able to do a little bit more of what I wanted to do, which was to work on developing country problems and move. And I'm unusual because most people do not travel and move so much. I've done 30 years outside my country, which is UK, and been living in 10 countries over that period. So average time of work is 3 years. That's not a normal situation, but it suits me very well because I think I have a high intolerance level for boredom and I need challenges. I like working with people. I enjoy being in different environments and learning. And the desire for learning, the desire for being able to understand people and make a better world or make a better administration or do things that inspire people and make a better environment is what drives me. So there is no plan, but I know what I like, and I've always taken jobs for which I was either competent or not competent, but which I could make myself able and competent to be able to take out those. So I think there are other people in this room who will have absolute direction, grit, career, perseverance. But what really matters is that you care about what you do and you keep doing it and you don't mind when you fail. And like in this most previous job in Water Footprint Network, things happen. Shit happens. You find yourself in a situation and you're into bankruptcy. So you learn. You learn how people behave in extremis, and it's not pretty. And you learn how to deal with banks and to handle quite large difficulties of finance. And in other circumstances, you learn from problems, from finding yourself in an organization when you feel like you're working for Hitler. It's not a pleasant experience, but coping and learning from that and understanding what it is that drives people to behave in that way and not repeating their errors is another means of going forward. So I don't believe in giving up, but I certainly believe in continual change and accepting that there isn't such a thing as a steady state. And we should just know that we're living in change and adapt and change and take advantage of the opportunities that are around us. That's how I feel. Thank you.
Thanks. And I mean, after the two of my fellow co-panelists, my journey has been fairly mundane. Although I must say that I think I always had some sort of a plan, but nothing has turned out to be as I had planned. So I grew up in India. I took a test to that. Almost everyone, when I was growing up in India, if you were good in studies, you wanted to be either a doctor or an engineer. So I took a national test to be to get into one of the institutes of technology. Got in. At that point in time, even sort of growing up, high school and so on, I wanted to be a forest ranger. I mean, I just loved hiking. I had a lot of family members who were situated, posted in parts of India that were just, national parks and forests and Himalayas. So I got to spend a lot of time, venturing out in those areas, and I wanted to be a forest ranger. That's what I had in mind. But by the time I graduated, it was no one in my in my sort of surrounding, whether it was my friends or anyone else that I knew was going in that direction. So I kind of by default interviewed for a job. It happened to be with a food company, with Nestle, and they were growing in India. I got recruited by them into a training, a graduate training program. And then I think what you just said in terms of, I just realized that whatever you think about when you're studying, in terms of how what you would like to do, how you would like to operate, and you have very little influence once you get into a job and you're working for someone, for an organization, and that to me was shocking. I mean, I had lived in this very idealistic sort of frame of mind as I was studying at IIT, and you're encouraged to think in those idealistic sort of frames. When you are at institutions like that or at MIT. But then when you go into the real world, it was, at least for me, I was just not, it was a real shock for me. I was looking at, we were setting up new plants, food processing plants, coffee, milk. And I always wanted to start with the basics, look at the thermodynamics, look at the fluid mechanics of what the equipments that'll be needed. And, this is all, I didn't have to do anything. It was all done. It was all designed in Switzerland. The designs came from Vevey, and all you had to do was to just make sure that it was all executed and implemented properly. And that was just not appealing enough for me. So I left Nestle very quickly. Came back to school because that's what I think a lot of people do once they encounter that shock. Did my master's in something that was a combination of fields that I liked. It was physics, mathematics, and engineering, so machine dynamics and tribology, surfaces and contact. And then out of that, which I thought I was making a better choice this time around, which I still think, I got into a company called United Technologies that was into a number of areas where some of what I had specialized in was useful. They're into aircraft engines, they're into air conditioning and elevators and so on. So I got into, again, a rotational, what they call a leadership development program. I started with what I knew best, which was product design. But then they quickly figured out that I had a strong voice, and I got the opportunity to go around the world in different functions. So as I said, started with product design, but then looked at manufacturing. Ultimately, was working for them in Europe, in Paris, and because they're in such a mature set of industries, the way and they were growing, and I was working for the CFO's office. The only way they could grow in Europe was through acquisitions. So I was doing M&A for them in Europe, and I fell in love with finance, with aspects of finance, with the fact that capital is probably the strongest lever that you have if you want to make a change in the world, and if you can help direct that capital, that I found fascinating, and in addition to the fact that finance was also very analytical and allowed, forced you to think strategically as well. So I just, and as I was in that role, I was getting pitched by banks on the other side about investment opportunities, and I said, this is what I'd like to do, because I'd like to work with a portfolio of things to think about and look at. So I came to business school here across the road, and then I've been the reason for making that move was to make the career switch, and then I've been with banks ever since. So it's a very different career path, and then I kind of basically muscled my way back into food and agriculture, because I started off as a generalist, and none of the banks and institutions that I was working with had a big practice. But then, a few years ago, 9 years ago, I had known Rabobank as a counterpart, more as an institution, going back to what you care about. From a values perspective, it seemed to be a great match. At that point in my career, I had done a lot. There was a steep learning curve in whatever I had done in banking, but there was also a work environment that I was just not comfortable with, and Rabobank being a cooperative by structure, and I'd known about the way as a counterpart seemed to be a different culture, and so I said this is where I'd like to be, and then it. At that time, I wasn't thinking much about the sectors that Rabobank worked in primarily, but I came over to head their products group in the U.S., but I just then came back to the food and ag kind of, maybe that was the seed that was out there in my mind from the beginning, and I loved that mission, and I set about expanding it here in North America, and then when there was a crisis situation in the bank back in. The bank had to pay a big fine to the regulators for LIBOR manipulation. So talk about an institution that has strong values and great culture, but it wasn't perfect. At that point in time, there were a lot of changes in the bank, and I was asked to become the CEO for the North American business, and that I was grateful to get that opportunity, and I really set about making sure that I make full use of it, not only to do what appealed to me, but also for all the staff that we had in the bank. They were in from a motivation perspective, not in a great position, not in a great sort of frame of mind. Also, the promise that the institution had in North America wasn't being fully utilized. And developed and promoted. So I sat on that path, and I think we've, just in terms of looking at the work that we have done since, especially with regards to innovation in food, water, agriculture, energy sort of nexuses, that has been, to me, the most deeply satisfying work that I've done so far. And just to interact with people like you. So I've enjoyed this phase, and I'm now again just thinking. You had your organization go through, had an event where it's forcing you to think about, okay, what's next. And for me, I'm forcing myself to think about what's next, because I think I'm becoming I had become the last couple of years, very comfortable in what I was doing. Then kind of you feel that you've done what you could do with this platform. Now I've been thinking about, okay, what's next? I've been thinking about being a principal investor, a fund, other nonprofit organizational sort of involvement in organizations, so things of that sort. So I think it's whether you have a plan or not, you're always thinking about, and I think if you're using as your guide the values that you hold dear, then I think it'll ultimately take you to the right places. So as long as you're making your choices based on something that is guiding you, that is beyond your immediate needs, that to me seems to work.
Mm-hmm. Do you have other criteria that you would say guide your choices towards your next steps beyond what you're really passionate about, the type of job, opportunities that are offered? In a sense, what criteria would you use to guide your next steps? Or if you were in our steps, what criteria would you use?
So I realized at some point that for me personally, the three things that are important to me when I'm looking just at life, I want to be somewhere where I can be comfortable outside. I want to be doing work that's interesting and good. And then there's everything else, a bucket with everything else in it, with the city I'm living in and relationships and everything else. And I'm not at all saying these are the answers. These are my three things. And so I'm constantly kind of pinging back and forth. Where are we in the three things? Where are we in the three things? But I've been in Chicago about 20 years now. Before I was in Chicago, I was in Houston. I hated Houston. It is hot and nasty. And I'm sorry if anybody in the room is from Houston, but hot and sticky doesn't agree with me. So that was not doing too well, but the other pieces were good. At some point, one of the other pieces wasn't doing so good, and I said, all right, I got to change something. So quite reactive, but not step change reactive, just constantly back and forth, what's good, what's good, what's good. So when I decided to leave PepsiCo, I like Chicago, I didn't move away. The work evolved in a way that I was evolving away from it. And I said, all right, time to make a change. So I would say that I would recommend really strongly, you need to know what are your 3 or maybe 4 or maybe 2, your core principles. And this is not too different from what Rajiv was saying. What are your things that are important to you, and how do you balance those? And that will give you some guidance.
Just picking up on that, I would say if you're thinking about making those choices, at least for me, the 2 things that have been important are, regardless of how much you have, experience you have under your belt, the opportunity to learn. So it has to be either there should be someone I can learn a lot from, or an organization and an environment that I can learn a lot from. I think that's important because there'll be lots of places out there where you can go in and do stuff and execute on stuff. But to me, it seems like if all of you are here, you're in institutions like MIT, I think learning, to me, it is important to you, and it was important to me as well. And that has been one thing that I think has been, regardless of whether I'm working for a Hitler or someone else, as long as there's an opportunity to learn, I think that has given me a basis for some satisfaction. So I think definitely look for that. The second thing I would say is, at least in my case, I've always tried to put myself in a situation where there's some level of discomfort. So whatever I'm going into, I want to make sure that there are elements that I'm scared about, that I don't know about. There's a lot of uncertainty, and you can do your due diligence, you can ask a lot of questions, but at the end, I think there should still be this feeling of, okay, there's a lot that I don't know, but it's something I want to, I want to try, I want to do. So I think just putting yourself out there has been important to me. It just confirms to me that I can continue to grow, and sometimes I'm successful, sometimes you just learn from going through that experience. But that has been, if you are going to make a change in your life, whether choose a career or change, who you're working for, make sure that it has that element of, that experimentation or a challenge. I think it's easy to go for comfort, but I would say that I think for all of you, I think it'll be good if you can, use each of those opportunities as an opportunity to stretch and grow.
Yeah, I suppose I started out always wanting to learn. That's absolutely straight. And always challenge. I started out really obviously working for NGOs with no pay, or so little pay as to be invisible to my parents. And I was just doing what I wanted to do. And I was amazed 5-10 years later to find that I was actually earning a salary, and then I was earning a large salary, and I was still doing things that I wanted. That's not given to everybody, because not everybody chooses to go for what they want. And I think learning experiences, not being afraid. I lived in different countries, and some of them are better than others. But I've enjoyed every country I've lived in, and I sort of use as a measure of saying, I don't want to live there. The first country that I ever said to myself, I never want to be there, never, never. I was traveling through Europe through train down to Greece, and I got stuck in Yugoslavia. And I just swore to myself, I'm never coming back. Never, never, no. This is not what. First job, there I am, living in Yugoslavia, going through a civil war. Yeah, it was tough. It was also wonderful to have experience, to have culture shock, and to learn. And after that, I've said, well, I can live anywhere. I prefer to have sunlight sort of at least 12 hours a day, not 12 minutes. But, you know, if I say that too loudly, I'll be in Montreal or in Stockholm next year. So you can't know. You just adapt. And I'm lucky because it doesn't matter to me the temperature. I can manage hot and cold. And I like it hot and sweaty. So I've lived in some hot and very sweaty places. And so that means it's a bit more flexible. You can look at different things. And the other thing is the flexibility that you can retrain. That's so good. I haven't needed to because I've just done climate change, then I've done water, then I've conservation. And you can do that because you're changing jobs. And you can also do retraining and go into areas that were not possible. So the nice thing about being born now and being at this stage is that you have more choices. The bad thing is that you have so many choices. It's not easy, and it really isn't easy. I fully agree. So sometimes you just have to throw the coin up in the air and hope for the best, because you can't possibly know what is the best thing to do. You can go for your inner feelings, you can go for your ideas, but you're going to make mistakes. And if you don't make mistakes, you won't make much progress. If you can't make mistakes and you feel you've got to have a perfect life, problem. You won't progress. You've got to make mistakes and learn from them. So that's what I'd say.
Are there challenges you faced early in your career that really you wish you had avoided?
I left school at 17 without having done my A-levels, which is what allows you to go to university in England. So yeah, that was a challenge. I think it was probably a larger challenge for my parents since I didn't communicate with them for a time. But the challenge was midway through living away from home and finding out I want to be a game ranger in Africa, writing off the letters. And they send back nice letters saying, I'm very sorry, but you don't seem to have any qualifications. And although I know that you have a good heart, and you think, oh dear. So it was really on the receipt of that letter that convinced me that I'd go back and do my A-levels and go to university and do PhD and all the rest of it, thinking I was going to be a game warden in Africa. But, you know, you learn, you change. You've got to have mistakes.
So when I graduated undergrad, as I said, I was not planning to go to graduate school at that time, and none of you were under this illusion at all. But at that time, the idea was you go and you work for a company for 30 years, or however long. To my knowledge, exactly one of my classmates has done that, and he just became the CEO of Chevron. So good for him. But of course, that's not how the world works anymore. But at that time, that was the mindset. So after I graduated, I had a job in Dallas, Texas, with a manufacturing company. And within about a month, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. I didn't like where I was living. I didn't like the fact that I was on second shift, although I knew that going in, that was part of the deal. I grew up in a blue-collar family. And my dad was an airline mechanic, and it was strike, layoff, strike, layoff. And one of my big proud things about being an engineer is that's never going to happen to me. No, it can happen to you if you're an engineer. And so I get to this company, and I don't like where I'm living. I don't really like second shift. It doesn't allow me to get to know anybody in the real world. And they're talking about the engineers going on strike. And I said, this is a disaster. And so I think I started in July, and in August, I signed up to take the GREs. I said, all right, I know how to go to school. I better do that some more. This felt like a colossal failure to me. Because again, at that time, the idea was you get your job and that's what you do. You march down the path. And so that was very psychologically hard on me. I am thankful to this day that I had enough sense to get out, but it was not an easy thing to do at all.
We switch hats, and if you were looking at current graduates for hiring in your company or a potential company, what would you look for, given that there's so many choices, and what do you see in a potential good candidate?
I think the one thing I would say, maybe before I answer that question directly, is if I'm looking at current graduates, some of what I said yesterday, I think there's always a sense of timing that's important. When I started in banking, investment banking, The area that was hot at that point in time was technology, and it just become hot. And I remember one of my mentors talking to me and saying, if I had gone into technology, when I graduated back in when it was the early '80s, I would have been, I would have given up by now. So I think that's the one thing you have to think about. Okay, what you're doing. Where's that sense of timing most appropriate? And I continue to believe that food, water, technology, agriculture, this is the time. So if you're looking, so don't look to join a financial institution. Do something real with your training and skills. But if I'm looking for people, the things I look for is as I said, what is it that drives them? Is it are they simply looking for a role that is out there and has been advertised, or do they have this passion to make some impact? That's what I look for. There are many other people in my firm who meet with people and they do other things. But I'm just really fascinated by people who have a sense of drive and desire and mission. Whether or not it's a good fit for the organization, I just love having those conversations.
So I suppose I probably haven't hired as many people as Rajiv, but I know perfectly well that it's not easy, and I know I don't always get it right. And you have to accept that you don't always get it right. But generally, I work on my intuition on whether I'm meeting somebody that I like and even that I don't like, that they're a little bit at the edge. But it is not always good to employ somebody who is in your model, in your line. You need, in an organization, in a group, you need to have a little bit of edge. So judging that is important. But if somebody has got the passion and can show that they are interested in what you are doing or what the organization is doing, and it's clear that they want it badly, that is a good reason to consider them. And then there's all the things about the non-verbal signals that they're giving off, the way they walk, the way they talk, all the things that your brain computes in 0.3 of a second and tells you whether you think you could work with this person or not. And so you spend much more time with those who are going to work closer with you. And you don't always get it right. I have friends who've been through processes where they've gone through 20 interviews in the same organization to get to the position, and after 6 months they say, absolutely not. So it's not easy getting the right people. So I have always tried to be as open as possible and to bring in outliers, to bring in different experiences and not judge whether somebody's got an MIT or a Boston University degree. That isn't really so much. That is not an entry point. That they have a degree and a master's is probably enough in most cases. For me, I would never say that a PhD is great in terms of taking on somebody, unless you needed those scientific skills. So I would look for some people who were generally at the level of mostly having done a master's on top of a degree. But it wouldn't stop me taking on people who didn't have a degree. What about you, Liese?
So there are two things, and one is easier to see up front and one is harder. What I think works best with me is when a person is able to be reasonably independent on the job. And this is almost impossible to see up front. But if someone needs guidance every single step of the way, that will not work for me. Again, this is a hard thing to see during the selection process. On the other hand, I really would rather not have someone who wants no supervision at all. So it's a fine line. The other thing, and this is very specific to me, I tremendously value written communication. And I know this is not really stylish, and I know I read constantly about how millennials, they text and they use emojis and they don't write whole sentences. It makes me crazy. I'm not saying that you're going to encounter this often, but you probably should be able to write in whole sentences. And I hope those of you that are writing theses, I hope that your advisors are kind of getting on you on this. Not everyone communicates in the same way, and you need to, so this is a more general statement. Not everyone communicates in the same way, and you need to be able to communicate with different kinds of recipients.
Yeah, I think it's important on that point. I work with a lot of people for whom English is not their first language, and probably quite a lot in this audience. It's really important not to judge people on their written, necessarily on whether they have great written English. I do a lot of editing, and it's a question of getting the level right. I don't disagree with you.
Yeah.
I need people to write sentences and then people to structure. But it may be that in their language it's quite clear.
No, very true.
And it takes a lot of luck sometimes.
No,
to get
that's a
somebody.
very good point.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Hi, my name is Whitney Mann. I'm a first-year Master of Environmental Management at the Yale School of Forestry. Thanks for all doing this extra panel. We appreciate it. My question is about leverage points. And we've heard from some of the panelists, for instance, Eliza Roberts was saying that the series scope is really limited to corporations. And then we heard from Bill Gill that the horizons for implementing sustainable change within a private company are sort of limited by their growth prospects. And so I would be interested to hear from all of you where you think the most impactful leverage points are, particularly when it comes to the water industry or problems confronting water. We've heard from Rajiv, you said that you think capital is the strongest lever, so I think maybe separately I'd be interested in hearing about how Rabobank informs their investment decisions and whether you're looking to economists or scientists. And then maybe this is a separate question, or maybe it guides your answers here, but in terms of the water issues that you see as most important, which companies do you think are doing the most impactful work on those issues? So I know that was a lot, but.
A lot of questions.
I can start with answering your specific question. So Rabobank is a regulated bank, both in its home country, the Netherlands, but also here in all parts of the world, here in the U.S. as well. So in terms of investment decisions, there's a lot that is prescribed by regulations. As a bank, as you know, if you're a regulated bank, there's somewhere in the world you're taking deposits, and then that's your source of capital, and then you're, for the most part, giving it out. And for Rabobank, bulk of that, happens in terms of loans or debt rather than equity investments. So we have a very well-developed, Rabobank was AAA rated until quite recently, and still continues to have a very good performance as far as the portfolio is concerned that the bank invests in. So there's a very well-developed credit process that starts with, as you say, it starts with the application of the knowledge. So we value we invest a lot in research and knowledge. Both, we have a research department that specializes. We don't publish any research to recommend buying or selling of stocks. All they do is fundamental research in the different sectors that the bank has activity in, but for ourselves, but for our clients as well. So not only in that, but every single person. So whether you're a coverage banker, whether you're a product specialist, we definitely try and make sure that they have that sort of specialized knowledge about the agriculture, the foods sector, that will help us as an institution make the right decisions. So that's kind of in the selection of the opportunities that come through the system, and then we have a very good system in terms of things are put together in proposals and they are vetted at different stages depending on what type of proposal it is, and ultimately it comes to a committee. So Rabobank is a cooperative, as I mentioned, by structure. A lot of the decision making, almost all of the decision making is collective. So unlike many other banks where you have someone having authority, you can sign off on 25 million of of proposals. We almost everything, unless some just de minimis amounts, does go to to a collective decision process, and that I think helps. Sometimes it's we complain about it internally. It's creates makes us a bit slower than we need to be. But I think it just leads to the best decisions. There's an environment of discussion and debate, but ultimately everyone gets behind those investment decisions. On the other hand, I've tried to do a lot more given the maturity and the explosive activity in the sector. So I've tried to do a bit more going beyond the comfort zone. So if you look at life cycle of companies in the food and agribusiness, if you look at that, Rabobank tends to focus on the middle, so the most mature, the best performing companies. I've tried to go to the earlier part of the curve and see what we can do with those companies, whether it is in some form of a hybrid structure between debt and equity or just pure equity. So we've been able to make some progress there, but I think there's a lot more to be done. And when you're thinking about what's the biggest lever of change, I think the highest risk-bearing capital will have the biggest leverage in terms of having change. So to the extent you can be entrepreneurs, to the extent you can be someone who's really putting equity to work, that will have the most impact. So that's just my advice.
I think in terms of leverage points, I worked in government, private sector, NGOs, and I think now at this time I'm still of the opinion that working with the private sector or applying issues with the private sector is the way that is likely to produce the best results. I have been disappointed working within UN and World Bank, or at least multilateral development banks, in their abilities to be able to move forward. And I think the stakeholder style NGOs, when you have them representing both companies and different interests, those NGOs can do a great deal of work in terms of advocacy and change more than they ever have been able to. So single issue NGOs are obviously interesting and fun to be with, but it's the ones that are really difficult, just working on the edge, maybe on a single issue, but they contain the elements of the different players within themselves. And so those are the organizations that I think are good. Great to be able to work in investment or work in foundations, but foundations don't change things generally. They follow trends. And so I would look more towards adventurous banks or investment, insurance and reinsurance, because they will be playing a lot in the future. So insurance and reinsurance is not to be ignored.
And I'm going to focus only on private companies, since that's my background primarily. And the answer is it depends. So I'm sitting here and thinking in my head of what companies have made a big difference and how. And I will say that if you want to do something faster, you're probably better off in a smaller place, not trying to fix the world. So there's a brewery in the western US, and they're not big, but they're in a water-stressed area, and they have done remarkable things because it's a small group. They can make decisions fast, and they can go. Whereas there are great big companies, Coca-Cola, who I did not work for, but a competitor of mine, Coca-Cola, has done global work. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of money. And it's going to take a longer period of time. So I think you need to ask yourself what time scale you're looking at. And do you personally want to make a difference in the world or in a place? Excuse me? New Belgium.
I had a specific question for Professor Dallbauman as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about taking a position at a university later in your career?
Yeah. So as I said, I didn't have a path, and I did not leave PepsiCo intending to become a faculty member. I literally didn't know what I was going to do. I was going to take a little time to decompress, as I called it, and then figure out what to do. And during my decompression time, the department chair at Northwest, the chemical and biological engineering department chair at Northwestern, who is a family friend, said, hey, I heard you have some time on your hands. Do you want to teach heat transfer? Do you want to teach optimization? What do you want to do for me? This is incredibly flattering. So it wasn't, again, not a path, and it's very rewarding. It's, I think that Linda's reason in asking me about this was she really likes to have industry exposure in her, and most faculty at Northwestern don't. So she thought it would be great to have a faculty member who had worked in industry. And it has been a very good experience. I think that it's been an evolving experience. Coming up next quarter, I will teach process optimization for the 3rd time. And I will teach a core chemical engineering class for the first time. And it's a very different pace than I've become accustomed to. Obviously, I went to college, so I know how this works. But I was a little out of practice. So it's very rewarding. It's stressful, and I apparently enjoy it because I keep doing it.
Are there any other questions in the audience?
Hi, my name is Ellen Abrams. I'm an MS MBA candidate at the University of Michigan, and my focus is on market-based solutions to global water and energy challenges. And one thing I've wrestled with is whether to pursue like a depth of expertise in one narrower area versus a breadth of knowledge across areas. So it's obviously a very personal decision, but I'd love some input on your thoughts on the trade-offs between becoming kind of a subject matter expert versus a systems level, higher level, broad expert, I guess.
I mean, I think it's good to recognize that there are systems, right? We've been all about water, and there have been occasional pop-ups about and climate change, and occasional pop-ups about and community and culture. But I think thinking from a system level is incredibly important, and the program you're in is a very good one, as you know. I think that going very far in depth, if that's the path you choose, you just need to always be aware that even though you're going deep, you're still connected to all those other pieces.
I will second that and say that I think in terms of making a personal choice, I think specializing in something doesn't preclude having that broader perspective. But just focusing on having a broader perspective can preclude, having depth of knowledge. So to me, at least personally, it seems like one is it's just you preserve it. By option theory, you preserve all the options at least. So I would value that more.
Yeah, I think it is difficult. If you do heavy research, then you're an expert for a short time, more important than anybody else in the world. You know it all for a month, a year, or a second. Great. That's depth. But you don't really need that. But you do need to understand subjects and to be respected by your colleagues for having grasped complicated issues. And that isn't enough. You've got to have a higher level of understanding about where the pieces come together. And that's what managers and that's what bosses need you to do. They need you to be able to go deep or come up.
And certainly have a good group of experts that you're comfortable talking to.
Yeah.
So I yesterday a couple times brought up Brian Richter, and sure enough, one of the other panelists was talking to me at lunch today and said, hey, I talked to Brian yesterday. So it's good to know people and have relationships with people. So even if you're not the nth degree expert on that, you can talk to them in a reasonable way.
Yeah, you've got to have people to pull down and get advice.
Yep.
And that's what the networking, that's what friendship over time is. It's why you never want to break friendships with people. You always have to consider that, sometime they'll be your boss. Or you'll be their boss. You never know which way it's going to turn out. So it's best not to be too rude to people.
Yep. That's good advice.
And I'd say just from being an international new entrant into a number of fields that I then went into, I think that it helps if you have a strong basis, understanding, specialization. You may not have anyone. When I came here, I did not know a single person at all. Yeah. If you have something that you can use to relate to people that you don't know, it helps quite a lot. So, and similarly, if you're looking to go out, as you did, you go out into the world from having spent most of your life in education here, I think it'll be useful to have that strong basis.
Speaking of networking and mentors, do you have any recommendation for that? Approaching somebody that you admire, you think their career is interesting. Do you have any words for that?
I think people come to me and it's clear that they are wanting implicitly or explicitly for help and advice, and I'm always happy to do that from people that I meet. I suppose in sort of looking up, there are people that I work with that I really admire and have kept up professionally and semi-professionally, but I just regard them as gods. They're there that I can call them up on a first name basis and speak to Paul Pullman or something else. It's great. But I don't think I compete in the same fishbowl. It is really useful to have people who can give you an access to point, because when you're that high above where you currently are, it's helpful because they can see very differently the perspective. So I think it's always good to try and reach up as far as possible. And whether it's Kofi Annan or it is the head of the Bank of New England, you do want to reach out to people. You should increase your Rolodex as much as you possibly can. You can never do too much networking. You really can't. Knowing people and then keeping those up, that is very helpful, or has been in my life at least.
I'd say I was very hesitant in doing that. I mean, I grew up in a country that was, socialist, maybe not formally in name, but it was, it was frowned upon to use anything other than your ability, your skills, as I said, and at least you make yourself believe that everything, is rational, so you don't need any kind of interpersonal support. So, and even when I came here, I would really hesitate to, it seemed like you're asking for help. It seems like you're cheating. Why should I get help when there may be other people who are probably not having those connections? And it took me a while to get over that, because as you said, it's always useful. You learn something, and there are people, whoever you ask and you go to, especially if you admire them, they are always willing. They will open up, they will help, they'll advise, they will learn something, and you will learn something. So it's not a one-way street. So you also realize that you are going to be, in some way, hopefully, adding to that person's perspectives as well. So I definitely have very strong, belief now in the fact that the more, especially if you admire someone, going to them and asking them, whether it's for help with a particular step that you're contemplating, but maybe even generally, is very, very useful, very educational.
Yeah. I really cannot recommend highly enough is talking to people that you like or think are really good. Yeah, you'll get rejected. Hello. Get used to it. That's what you've got to get used to. You've got to get used to being rejected and keeping on. It's okay. Don't take it personally. Who knows what they were doing for breakfast? It's just what it is. And you really just need to try and make the connections and try and understand what other people are doing. Honestly, however important somebody is, they honestly sometimes enjoy just sitting down and talking about non-entities or talking about things, and you can call people up on any issues. You shouldn't feel a big gap. It's not the same as it was. My father would have seen me for tea at 5 or 6 o'clock, but I would have had supper on my own and I'd have been just like that. A relationship in which you'd call your father sir was quite normal in the generation before mine. Hello? I have a relationship with which my kids sort of curse me or speak to me more at a level that is no space, no gap. So take advantage of that. It's reduced. We are much closer in the generations than we ever before. Music brings us together, and we should use that and feel that you're not just a young student. You are a person and just as interesting as any other.
I have to say that I am much weaker in this particular aspect than my two co-panelists are. I have never had a formal mentoring relationship at all, probably in either direction. A long time ago, I got very involved in the American Institute for Chemical Engineers, which is a professional society for chemical engineers. And I would go to separations division meetings, and after a while, I was on the board, and then I got let go from a job. And I sent everybody, hey, I'm gonna have a new email address, here's my personal email. And I had people, professors specifically, who are gods in separation, saying, oh, have you tried this and this and this? Never would have occurred to me to ask them to do that, ever. So I will say that having connections, we talked about this before, having connections is a good thing, and a good way to have connections is to be involved, not just contact somebody and say, hey, I want to get to know you. Be involved in something. The water club, right, is great. So be involved in things. That will expose you to people that you might not meet otherwise. And those relationships with those professors still carry on. I saw one last week in the Minneapolis airport. Hey, Bill, how you doing? And we just passed each other. We're both on our way to planes, but it's like, hey, Bill Koros, how you doing? I'm great. And it's a nice relationship to have. As far as being a mentor, I will say that I have been, nobody's ever asked me to mentor them, but people have said, you have been a great mentor to me, and I have no idea what I've done. And so that tells me that I'm setting a good example, which is a nice thing to hear. I'm still not quite sure what I'm doing that's such a good example, but I think that that's a nice thing. So if someone is helping you, even if they don't know it, tell them. They'll be happy to hear that for sure.
Good question.
I think on that note, we'll wrap it up to not eat away into the afternoon panel. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.